Hello, Northern California. My name is Emily Doolin, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Brooke USA. I want to thank everybody for your time today. I know that you're all busy, but all of us at Brooke USA are delighted to continue growing our small family throughout California. We certainly had big plans to visit with you this year, host our first signature event at Menlo Park, and participate in a ton of equestrian events throughout the state. All these plans have been put on hold for obvious reasons. Hopefully, we will be able to see you in person sometime during 2021. I always like to start our presentations by telling you who we are and what we do. Brooke USA is an independent 501c3 nonprofit organization headquartered in Lexington, Kentucky, with staff all over the country. We don't have an office, we all work from home. Our board of directors is comprised of 14 members from all over the United States as well. They make all the governance and granting decisions for the organization. We focus our efforts basically in two areas: fundraising to grant funds to Brooke and other organizations with similar missions and goals. The other, which is really new to us and very exciting, is the area of advocacy. Yes, this year we will be working in the Capitol, in Washington, D.C., to ban the import of EGL, which is a byproduct of donkey hides used in traditional Chinese medicine. These donkeys are slaughtered in horrific ways for their skins. So we are going to ask government to not allow the sale of this product in the United States. We are licensed to use the name Brooke, and we do it with great pride. The reason being is that this organization, meaning the Brooke, is the best at helping working equines in the developing world while integrating the needs of families into their scope. I always tell people that what I love about this organization is the fact that we get to help people and animals at the same time. This connects especially to me because I've always worked in both areas, but not at once. I've always gone from human health to animal welfare and back and forth. But this job is perfect because it allows me to do both. Our mission is to significantly, Amanda, I can't see it, so hold on a second. I have to read it. Our mission is to significantly improve the welfare of working horses, donkeys, and mules, and the people they serve throughout Africa, Asia, the Middle East, the Americas, and the Caribbean. Now I have to find my other slide. Somehow I lost it as well. It's crazy. Okay, let's see. As you can see, what's most interesting about our mission, and maybe new to some of you, is the fact that we're now working in the Americas, which means that we can support organizations in the US. We mainly do this in time of disaster, an earthquake, a hurricane, tornadoes, or so on. But I think that what's really exciting is that we have the ability to support Native American reserves, because we know that their needs and their problems are basically identical to those in the developing world. And for those of you who know, they're separate nations anyway. So it's very important and very exciting for us to be able to support those Native American tribes. This slide is most interesting because what it means is that Brooke USA looks at programs that fund communities, or that provide communities with the skills, knowledge, and other resources that are needed to care for working equines. An example would be maybe like husbandry training or something like that. We also look at programs that exist in perpetuity and independently. An example would be the creation of an equine community group that join forces so that they can ensure that a farrier visits with them on a weekly basis or something like that. So that will continue to happen whether Brooke or any other organization is still present or not. We also support programs that increase women's economic independence and purchasing power. An example would be building a collaboration of women where they can pull the donkeys together to do the work and to work more efficiently. And sometimes they can bring in additional money for their household or even additional money for themselves, which I think is extraordinary. And the last thing is that we promote efforts that impact the humane treatment of working animals at the government level. This can be from the very local legislation in a community or in a municipality to a country, but we go all the way to the United Nations. So that's kind of the areas that we focus on. The next slide, Amanda.
Now it's not moving. There we go. I got it.
So, you know, one of our greatest prides as an organization is our ability to be flexible, to adapt, and to change. And we just have to do that right now with COVID-19. COVID has hurt us dramatically. We canceled our Wellington event, which raises over $300,000 for us each year. And our donations in general are down. But we know that people's priorities right now in the US are really focused on personal matters. And our country is facing economic distress, civil unrest, and our upcoming elections. So there was no way for us to not do something that could be locally driven, but also stay true to our mission. So to this end, we created Brooke USA's Response and Recovery Fund, which supports organizations both in the US and abroad who are in desperate need. In the US, horses are being abandoned at roadsides, they're dumped at rescues, and they're going without food. So we felt that we had to do something. I mean, I truly believe that charity begins at home. And we know that the citizens of this country wanted us to do something locally. Abroad, the problems are also great and are compounding. People in rural communities do not have the means to isolate. They can't quarantine. They still have to get up in the morning. They still need to go to the river to fetch water. They still need to go to the market to sell produce and food. If people get sick, they suffer, their families suffer, and their donkeys suffer. So we are not hearing much about what's going on in countries like India or Pakistan or Guatemala, but we're certainly concerned because their numbers are escalating daily. And with very little healthcare capacity, especially for those that are impoverished, we know that the situation is going to get worse and worse, and we're going to have to help more and more. And we're ready to do so. And again, we will adjust and change to make that happen. What you see the slide right now is a list of all the organizations we have helped. There's a total now of 20, I believe, and we've given them over $32,000. And they're micro grants to just help them get over the hump, but certainly very useful. Also very useful to us because as we talk advocacy and going to Washington, we hope that these organizations will jump on board with us and help get our message across. Anyway, enough about me because I know you want to listen to Dr. Jones. It's not only his depth of knowledge, it's his very cute accent. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass this on to Amanda. Amanda is our Major Gifts Officer. She is the person responsible for putting this meeting together. And I know that many, many of you know her already. She's assigned to work in California. She will introduce Dr. Jones, and I know that she's going to be regimental about the instructions needed to participate today. Thank you all for being a part of our family. We're very, very grateful. Amanda?
Hi, everybody. I think I know most of you, and if I don't, it's nice to virtually meet you. Emily made me sound a little bit stricter than I am. I'm not, but I did want to say that we will be monitoring questions. So if you want to type your questions in the chat box where it says send a message to all panelists, we will be monitoring that chat box to be able to pass any of your questions on to Dr. Jones. We will try to monitor the Q&A, but on this end of Zoom, it's actually kind of confusing. All those questions don't go to the same place, and the chat box actually pops up and tells me that there's a message. The Q&A does not. So if you do have a question for Dr. Jones, please feel free to just type it in there, make sure it says to all panelists, and we will be able to get it answered. As Emily said, I'm the Major Gifts Officer for Brooke USA. I also work in California. I work very closely with Melissa Klarner, who's the chair of our California Advisory Committee, and I know she is on here today, so I wanted to give her a little shout out to say how grateful we are for all of her help in assisting us as we move our at our very slow COVID-19 affected pace to try to meet more of you out there. And I'm glad that we're able to do this virtually, even if it's not in person. So with that, I am very proud to introduce Dr. David Jones. Dr. Jones is a vet and a zoologist, and if you have been around with Brooke USA for any length of time, you probably already know a little bit about him because he is our founding chair. He is a large part of the reason that Brooke USA exists here in the US. He's a vet and a zoologist, Director Emeritus, Dr. Jones of the North Carolina Zoo, is that correct? He was also with the Zoological Society of London. I did a quick Google of you, Dr. Jones, and I found that you've worked in more than 50 countries. So he's an extraordinarily interesting man, and Emily is correct that his accent is very charming. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to you, Dr. Jones.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to tell you a little bit mostly about Brooke's international work, but first of all, just a little bit of history. I know many of you already know the sort of early origins of Brooke, and I'm talking about the Brooke family and where it started. But I know a couple of you listening in probably are not so familiar. So in a nutshell, what happened was that Dorothy Brooke, who obviously gave her name to the charity, was sent to Egypt with her husband in 1931. Her husband was the commander of the British Cavalry Regiment after the First World War. And in Palestine, most of you know the war horse story, where, of course, 1 million horses were sent, some of them, by the way, from the US, but mostly from the UK, to Flanders as transport, artillery, cavalry for the First World War. But there was a smaller version of that in the Middle East when the Brits were fighting the Turks, the old Ottoman Empire. Those animals were supposed to have been sent back to the UK, but in fact landed up in Cairo. And Dorothy, when she went there in 1931, was appalled to find many of these old war horses still living. Some of them, of course, were quite old at that time and pretty decrepit. There are photos in the archives in Cairo of animals being worked with broken backs, with 3 legs, pretty horrific stuff. They thought there were about 300 in Cairo. There turned out to be 5,000. And over 3 years, Dorothy and a team working with her bought up all 5,000 of those animals, and with the money left over, founded a small clinic in what were then the slums of Cairo. It's now actually quite an upmarket residential area, but the hospital is still there. And from that, Brooke's beginnings started. I've been with the Brooke 50 years this year, as on a voluntary basis, but in many capacities. So I've seen it grow substantially from what was $80,000 to $100,000 business in the early 70s to a multi-million 14-country operation as it is now. And as Emily has said, of course, most of the work that we do is international, mostly in developing countries, but in recent times we've been doing a lot more in the Americas as well, quite rightly, given our base of Brooke USA here in the US. So with that, just a little bit about the background of the work we do. This figure staggers most people. About 1/6 of the world's population live on something like $2 to $3 a day. And at the very bottom of that economic number, 1 billion people, billion with a B, most of those people depend on working animals for their livelihood. And about 2/3 of the working animals are horses, mules, and donkeys. You've obviously got cattle, oxen, camels, other working animals as well. But horses, mules, and donkeys make up by far the majority of that. We believe today from UN, United Nations figures, that there are about 112 million working horses, mules, and donkeys, supporting something like 6 to 7 people per animal. That's men, women, children, all aspects of a family. They're all supported. Very often, a family is supported by just one animal on which they're totally dependent. So this is a big enterprise. Even with that, have the next slide, Amanda. Even with that, we get to about 2 million of those animals every year. Brooke gets to about 2 million. And as you saw in an earlier slide, I mean, Brooke is the major of all the internationally operating equine organizations. There aren't many of them. There are 4 actually in the UK, but Brooke is by far the most active and probably by far the most advanced in the type of work that it does. And most animals, particularly equines, are not valued or have not been valued until recently in the way that other forms of domestic animals are. As you probably know, particularly in Africa, but to a certain extent in Asia as well, animals are the money of many of these people. They are the savings. So in Africa, for example, where you see large herds of goats and flocks of goats, sheep, cattle, those are their savings, their bank. And it's quite interesting that until about 5 years ago, the animal equivalent of the World Health Organization did not recognize equines, horses and donkeys, as livestock. They were not treated with the same value, both on an international basis and on a local basis as well. And I think that the thing that really came home to me one day in northern Kenya, visiting, and I've visited almost all the Brooke operations, certainly in the developing world, was the fact that donkeys were being used to carry water. This is on the northern Kenya-Somali border. Donkeys were being used to fetch water from the only source of water, which was a river about 10 miles away, to bring the water to camels. We all grow up thinking, you know, camels are these animals that can do without water for days on end. Actually, donkeys are much tougher than camels, and it's the donkeys that are bringing the water to the cattle, the goats, the sheep, and the camels. And that's just one example of why equine working animals are so important. A nice little slide. This is actually a brick kiln in India, and the bricks in this case being used as stabling. One of the things that Brooke has done a lot of over the years is advocate for shelter at night. So many animals are just left out in the open, and a lot of the things that we've been doing in recent times has been trying to make special shelters for animals, at least away from heat, from flies, to stop dehydration. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. Next one. So what do all these animals do? Let's just come back one, Amanda, to the water. I've mentioned water and the donkey's role for camels, but of course these animals are even more important for their human owners. Water is a big issue globally. 17 countries now are in water deficit. That means that less water is accumulating than they're using, and over 40 more countries are running into water deficit. Even here in the Southwest, for example, our states in the Southwest are almost certainly going to run short of water. They already are running short of water, and you know that yourselves from what's going on in California. But you imagine having to walk 7 or 8 miles every day to get enough water to cook in, water for not bathing. You're not going to be able to take a shower. And in these days of COVID, it's quite interesting when everybody's saying, and now wash your hands. Most people can't have enough water to wash their hands with. So water is a big issue, and pack animals like donkeys are really, really important in this respect. Okay, what next? So transport. It's quite, when I first linked up with Brooke, this is in 1970, somebody said to me, you know, you're wasting your time. All this business of animal transport and animal use, they're all going to be replaced by engines sooner or later. All these farmers in India and Pakistan and Africa, they'll all have little plows, little motorized plows. And what has happened is completely the opposite. Apart from the fact that many of these machines, they can't afford to buy these machines, and of course they can't maintain them, and they can't afford to buy the gas for them. So what has happened is the number of working animals has actually increased substantially over the last 50 years and doesn't show any signs of falling off. We're seeing an increase in the number of working animals. Just remember that if you've got a donkey or a horse and you live at least in a rural situation, and of course many of them are kept in urban situations, it's much easier to turn the animal out to graze on whatever vegetation happens to be available as the fuel, rather than go out and spend a lot of money on gas and maintaining engines. Apart from anything else, they're more flexible, animals are more flexible, and are far more useful. Okay, anything else? Have a look at the next one. So what sort of things do they carry? This is a slide showing building materials being carried. I've seen animals carrying, you know, large loads of stone, of wood, of all sorts of things to market. You imagine anything that you normally expect to get from time to time around the house. Animals are largely the way this is transported in many of these countries. This slide I think is probably in Pakistan or India, but absolutely essential for this sort of use. Next one. This is again when I started with Brooke, and Brooke in the 1970s was only operating in Egypt, where it had already started, 40 years before. And up until fairly recently in Cairo, all the garbage, all the waste was collected after 10 o'clock at night. This is in Cairo, after 10 o'clock at night and before 4 o'clock in the morning by donkey carts. There was no such thing as machines picking up all the garbage. So what would happen at 10 o'clock is a particular population, a small Christian population, Coptic Christian population, that lived in the cemeteries around Cairo, actually collected the garbage. And it was done with donkey cart, usually 2 or 3 donkeys abreast, who went out, crept out quietly at 10 o'clock at night and collected the garbage from the Cairo city streets. That has been replaced, largely replaced now, but in those days they were the garbage collectors of Cairo, and for many communities that's exactly what they remain now. I love this slide. A lot of these countries do much better with recycling than we do, frankly. Recycled materials like these plastic bottles are actually valued, and they will turn them into something else. Luckily, of course, these are pretty light, so although that looks like a huge load, at least the burden is fairly light. Just one comment here: you're seeing a lot of carts in these pictures. One thing we found fairly early on, I'll come down to, we'll talk in a minute about the sort of problems that we see. But one of the things we found was very often, because these carts are not particularly well maintained, is the animal was not only pulling the load and the cart with the load on it, but the mechanics were so inefficient that a lot of our work earlier on was actually mechanical in nature, that we were actually advising on how to design better carts, better wheels, better axles. So our sort of work gets into a lot of other sidelines apart from the obvious husbandry. Next one. Tourism. We're involved with communities that are very active in tourism. This lady is actually a pilgrim to one of the Hindu sacred sites in Kashmir. We look after, for example, the animal community that serves tourism in the archaeological site in Petra, and in many of the cities, particularly, for example, Luxor, up and down the Nile, which in normal times has a high tourism level. You're seeing brightly decorated, what they call gharries, they're horse taxis. And we actually have a competition every year in Luxor for the best kept gharry. So transport, animals being used in transport for tourism is another critical part of their role. What next? What have we got next? Agriculture, of course, we've mentioned. Most ploughing, of course, across the third world, the developing world, is done by oxen and cattle, sometimes by horses, and quite a bit in Africa actually by donkeys as well. So there's certainly some communities where equines serve an important ploughing role, but they're also, of course, using equines in the agricultural industry generally, particularly for transportation of farm produce. Water pumps, this is an unusual one. Not sure where this picture was taken, probably Egypt, probably in the Nile Valley, but here being used to lift up by what's a very ancient method, and a rather unusual use for the donkey in this particular case. But just showing this sheer variety of the uses that equines have. On to the next. And again, Amanda, I think let's just move on a bit. Next one. This is sugarcane. And then what you're seeing there, of course, horses being used in cattle ranching. And here another slide of animals being used to carry, in this case, food for livestock. Okay, let's see what the next one is. Perishable. This is the local milkman. In this case, taking milk from the farm to market, not delivering door to door, as some of you may remember from childhood. This one is we're taking it to market to sell in the marketplace. And another one, wood, and again, let's have a look. What's the next one? Yeah, one of the things, there's a couple of slides on this. We do work in very remote places, particularly in the Himalayan region, in northern Afghanistan, in Nepal, in the Hindu Kush in Pakistan, where very often the only means of transport, getting to some of these remote villages, is horses, mostly horses and mules. And so when Brooke teams go into these areas, obviously not on a regular basis, but they go in from time to time to help train. They're going through some pretty rough country. Next one. This is a very interesting slide. We only discovered recently the presence of coal mines in northern Pakistan, which are serviced by donkeys and by small, what we would in the past have called pit ponies. What's staggering about this particular industry is these animals are being taken down something like 1,000 feet below the surface. And can you imagine, the coal industry is a pretty dirty industry anyway, but you imagine when you haven't got machines, and that even then, safety is obviously a key issue. You imagine in this situation where this guy is going down on spiral pathways deep down to 500 to 1,000 feet below the surface, where he's hacking coal out just with the light of his headlamp, loading panniers on either side of the donkey and coming back up. Maybe manages 2 or 3 loads like this per day. And for that, he would probably earn about $2. Okay, next slide. Lots of examples here of animals. Brick kilns, there are something like 35,000 family owned and run brick kilns in Pakistan and India. Huge, huge number. And nearly all of them serviced by migrant labor, in many cases, making the bricks, often owned by a local family, who then will operate horses, usually horses, but sometimes donkeys as well, carrying bricks to be dried and then bricks to wherever they're going to be used. This is a huge, huge industry in this part of the world. And certainly in India and Pakistan, I'd say about a third of all the work that Brooke does is connected to brick kilns. Okay. Next one. Rather like the previous slide where you saw animals being used in long distance in remote areas, we have had to deal with quite a number of disasters, and most of you will have heard about them, particularly again in the Himalayan region, and also, of course, with famine relief sometimes following an actual disaster, earthquakes, particularly in the Himalayan region, where we've been sending Brooke teams in to help in emergency situations. Next one. Construction industry. I think we can probably, Amanda, move on to the slides where we're talking about what we actually then do. So what is the problem? Well, most of it relates to just these 6 things. Animals being overworked, just working for long hours a day. I've seen situations where teams of people working 10 hours a day are using the same animal 24 hours a day. And the sort of lack of recognition that animals need rest as well as humans. And if you look through this list, poor nutrition, dehydration, not giving them enough water, lameness, all sorts of causes, poor harnessing, either because the materials used were insufficient or because they didn't know how to do it, and a number of endemic diseases, particularly things like African horse sickness, trypanosomiasis, and a wide range of chronic respiratory situations, particularly where you're working in brick kilns, stone mines, coal mines, and so on. But the thing is that when you look at the background to all these problems, they almost always relate to poverty combined with a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding as to how to best look after these animals. The thing that strikes me over the years, the thing that's really it's very worrying in a way, is that there are many, many times when families have to decide between whether they spend money on feeding the family or feeding the animal. And one may find that sort of unusual, but the reality is for most of these people, if you're on $2 a day, which is not, by the way, consistent, a family may go for a week and earn nothing, and then may earn maybe $4 or $5. They've got to make really tight decisions. So they're working and making decisions on a very much a day-to-day basis. Next one.
We have a question that came through really quickly that I'd like to ask, which is, and when we were talking about the brick kilns, how much of the bricks that we use are in the world are supplied from those brick kilns?
None. It's all a local market. It's all a local market. They're very rarely transported more than about 20 miles. Now, what usually happens in most situations is the contractor, the builder, will come and get those bricks, and they will use motorized transport. But within the kiln itself, in most cases, animal transport for the local use. Although there are certainly situations where donkey carts will take bricks 5, 10 miles even. But no, brick use is all local.
I think, Amanda, we have to remember that there's 1.4 billion people living in
Mhm.
India, and there's a surge in construction in that nation. So it's all being used there.
Yeah.
A huge nation with billions of people.
Yeah, absolutely. No, in fact, that's why, of course, the brick industry is so huge. This is an iconic slide. About 15 years ago, Brooke took on a professional photographer for a year and got them to go all over the Brooks operations around the world and built a collection of really iconic photographs. This I always say about this photo, if you want an example of something, of a picture that tells what 1,000 words will not tell, this is it. This sums it up in a way. Overloading, probably poor nutrition, probably dehydration. So a whole lot of issues that you have to remember all the time, driven really by poverty. It's not, I remember in the early days of Brooke, many of our supporters were entirely animal oriented. They couldn't make a link between the animal and the owner. And so much of our work was very clinical. It was directed at the animal only, not at the owner. And I remember hearing time and time again comments, these cruel people, who manage these animals, can't we just stop them having these animals? And the reality is it's not driven by cruelty. Many of these, many situations where the animal and the human are very close. The problem is it's driven by a need to generate income. Okay, Amanda, thank you. Next one. So what do we do? As I mentioned, in the early days, Brooks' operation was very clinical. We would go into a marketplace, we would go into a village, and we were looking for sick animals, animals that were injured, animals that were lame, animals that clearly were not well. And so everything was oriented towards a clinical approach. But the problem is a clinical approach on its own is a dead end, because say you put an animal on a course of antibiotics for 10 days, you can't guarantee that owner would come back on days 2 or 3 to receive the dose. And unless you are training, unless you're helping these people to help themselves, all you're doing is you're creating a continuous issue and only providing clinical help. Now, that doesn't say that we don't any longer do clinical work. We absolutely do, and particularly as an introduction to a community. You imagine a community, let's say, in remote Senegal, out in the country, and one day someone in a white coat driving a Toyota truck comes along and says, look, I'll give you this stuff for free. Can you imagine their first thought? Is this government run? I'm very suspicious. I need to make a relationship with these people. So often a clinical approach, a gentle clinical approach, looking at what their issues are, but giving them some immediate help, is one way that we get the confidence of a community and can then begin to build what is a sustainable situation and begin to train people to look after themselves. Next one. It's really, really critical that organizations like Brooke have an exit strategy as well as an entry strategy. So many not-for-profits, particularly in the animal world, often have great plans for going in and working with animals and with people, but you need a plan to get out again. And so Brooke actually is very good at having a strategy which sets a time frame. It's flexible, but the expectation is that after a period, let's say 2, 3, 4 years of involvement, we don't let them go completely. There's always a monitoring situation, but that they are helped for a period of time. They're trained, people in the community are trained, and very often, of course, that creates new small industries. So the harness maker, the guy who gets the drugs, the guy who does the shoeing, the guy who grows the food, you're actually creating an economic situation beyond just the assistance to the individual's economic help as well. Culturally relevant is a phrase here that's important too. Well, one has to remember that although, we'll probably come on to it in just a moment, although women and children are the main users of these animals, the property of the family is owned by the man. And so and this is only one example of being culturally relevant, and it's another example of just being very careful about how one approaches new communities to engage with them. So what we do always has to be culturally relevant. I think it's quite interesting. People often ask, because we say we have a big team of advisors in London, but in fact, every single employee of Brooke around the world, bar one or two, and there are about 1,000 of them, are all nationals of their own country, and in most cases are local people as well. So they know the communities, that they're working in. And that's really critical. Next one. Water is a really, really critical element in everything we do. It's amazing how many people in community, when we first go into communities, how often obviously they're very aware of the water they need, but they often don't think that the working animal needs water as well. And because water is such a scarce commodity, very often these animals are not given sufficient water. And water, it takes time. Somebody's got to go and get the water. Water is difficult to find and so on. So water is key to many of the health problems that we see. Next one. Using local materials. It's very easy to, and we often get questions about this, can we go buy a load of veterinary equipment and send it to this country or that country? And the reality is that's not the way to do it. One of the things that we teach is how do you use materials you've already got? So whether it's harnessing, and whatever that harnessing is made from, whether it's hoof care, a lot of these things can be made from local materials. And of course that has a cost implication, and everything that we do, of course, has to relate ultimately to what can this family, what can this owner really afford. And one of the things in creating a sustainable situation is that we obviously want the harness maker and the farrier to earn a living, but then the animal owner has got to be able to pay for that. And so the economy has to be scaled down to the point where, unlike so much foreign aid, particularly in the past, it's much better now, but a lot of foreign aid in the past would provide materials that cannot actually be replaced once that aid finishes. It's really, really important that one uses materials that can be obtained locally and are relatively inexpensive. Next one. Another one. I think we've got one or two more slides.
I think Amanda is frozen. So in the meantime, Dr. Jones, one of the questions that I had was, it's also very difficult. My understanding is that it's also very difficult to get donated items to the developing world because it's expensive to transport them there. When they get there, they are put on hold, they're stolen. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, absolutely.
Am I still frozen?
No.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we used to have a lot of problems, for example, taking pharmaceuticals from a European source or an American source into countries where they used it for a while, but then they couldn't replace it. And very often they were stolen, particularly things like antibiotics and anesthetics and so on. So it's very, very important that one tries to use whatever is available on a local basis. Amanda, can we go back to there's one with the donkey in a shelter?
That one?
Just go, no, the one before, yeah. Just, Emily mentioned briefly the question of donkey hides. And this in the last couple of years has become a real concern to us and to many others.
Yeah.
This picture was probably taken in Kenya. And although there is and Kenya has been is the hot spot in regard to animals being slaughtered, donkeys being slaughtered for their skins, and many donkeys being stolen, cross borders, all sorts of issues going on with donkeys being killed for this product that the Chinese use in a sort of traditional medicine. And really the start of our government-oriented activity has really been kicked off by this horrible donkey hide trade. So the hope is that by being active with not only the Kenya government, but also with other governments in trying to shut this trade down, it's something that we're very much on top of right now. Next one. Yes, handling is all important. Of course, that's really critical when it comes to children. Generally, I found anyway over the years that kids can be, little boys particularly can be show-offs. One sees in the brick kilns, stone mines occasionally, particularly if visitors are there, that kid likes to show he's got a stick. And is rather surprised when he's suddenly told that that is not the right thing to do. But generally speaking, with training, the kids have a natural aptitude to look after animals properly and build very close relationships with them. Next one. Got to remember that many of the communities, particularly the women in the communities, this is nearly an all-male audience here, are illiterate. They don't read or write. And so much of what we do in training, and so not so much in Africa, but very much so in India, where a lot of the training has to be done with pictures, models, diagrams. I've sat frequently with women's groups in India in the dust while Brooke staff are actually demonstrating a technique with sticks in the dust, making pictures and models, just using models to illustrate how to do things. But working with communities, working with community leadership particularly is quite critical. So you can imagine again going into communities to try and get introduced, to try and develop a working relationship. That the key, who are the movers and shakers in that village? Where is the leadership? Where are the people are most trainable? Where are the ones that are interested in being trained? But very often, as I say, because there is a considerable economic advantage, not only to the individual, but to the village itself in all of this, those people are never that difficult to find. Next one. So yes, a whole range of professions, if you like, farriers and paravets. Paraveterinary for Brooke is very much like a lot of the other aid agencies use, which is actually training in a limited number of diagnosis and treatments. You're not going to give somebody a 5-year university degree. But the point is that a lot of this, things like simple nutrition, things like water, things like treatment of harness sores, simple hoof issues, that can be done very easily by the villagers themselves, or the people who are most easily trained within those villages. Okay. It's amazing how many, a lot of owners, I can remember talking to owners about feeding and buying, they were buying food that was totally unsuitable at usually a very much higher price than they could grow it or could buy it themselves. And so again, it comes back to local materials. It's no good telling them about feeding vitamins and minerals, for example, that they've got to buy expensively from some shop in the town. That much of this is about actually how can you produce it, or how can somebody in the community produce it for you at a reasonable cost. Okay. Kids. Many of these kids, of course, will go on and do something else than stay on the farm or within the rural community, but a lot of them do stay, and many of them are going to be the followers to their parents, their mothers particularly, in terms of using animals for their day-to-day lives. So really training kids, educational program. This is almost certainly taken in Kenya, where there's a quite an advanced Brooke program in child education. Okay. Lovely picture. We mentioned women are so critical in all of this. And going back to the culturally sensitive point, because women are powerless from a sort of political and ownership point of view in so many communities, it's sometimes quite difficult to get communities to accept that the best people to train, not only in their own husbandry of their own animals, but also on a village basis, are the women, not necessarily the men. But you can imagine some of the arguments that go on in trying to get some of these communities to understand that their women are the ones that are going to, in the end, provide the best husbandry for the animals that the whole village depends on. Okay. Again, Emily mentioned the government leaders and the policy makers. If you can get to the regional governor, if you can get to the national government, which we are in several countries, you can do an awful lot of good things in a relatively short time. If you can build on the animal welfare legislation, for example, if you can get some very simple things brought into law which protects animals and protects rural people, where countries will accept that. Senegal, where we've worked for the last 6 or 7 years, very good example of an African country which is really wholly accepting of creating legislation which is going a long way towards both protecting animals and protecting rural communities. Amanda, next one. That says it all. I think that's probably the last slide, is it? Yeah.
There was a question that I think is really interesting, which is, and I think probably any of the three of us can answer this, and we'd all have a different answer, but we should do it quickly because we don't have a lot of time. What do we consider a successful project, and how do we define what success is?
You want me to answer that?
I think, yeah, if you want to start, and then Emily, you're muted, so you're talking, but I can't hear you. If Emily can figure out how to unmute. There you go.
Dr. Jones, do you want to start on how we measure success from a Brooke USA standpoint, and then how we measure success from a Brooke standpoint?
Well, I wouldn't have thought there was very much difference in the end. You mean from a Brooke USA point of view in being able to provide funding from? Yes. I mean, I don't know whether everyone that's listening realizes that Brooke USA is a major funder of the Brooke family. And that is our principal purpose for Brooke USA. At the end of the day, for the Brooke family in the field, then the measure of success is to have a community within a reasonable period, say 3 to 4 years, able to look after its animals in the best possible way. That may not be 100% in terms of the way we would look in the Western world,
Certainly not
developed world, but it's certainly the objective is to leave a community with a much greater ability to look after its animals and be able to economically support that and economically benefit from all of that. So that's the sort of objective in a nutshell.
And I'm going to answer it from our standpoint, Dr. Jones, and interrupt because you are the founding chairman and you will be the forever chairman of Brooke USA. So I think that we have had so many successes when it comes to Brooke USA. If we look at our past, we have quadrupled our revenue, and we have given now close to $2.5 million to Brooke alone, which I think is a huge success. But when we look at what we've done and we're most proud of, the easy thing to look at are our brick and mortar programs, which people adore. It's building water troughs throughout Ethiopia, providing access to water, building health posts and clinics so that people have access to care. And with the building of all those brick and mortar programs comes the training of people that creates jobs for them. So I think that from our standpoint, that's great successes. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. We're able to evaluate it as we go along. So that's huge. I think that also when we look at, from my standpoint, at our Women for Donkeys program, which really tries to, we've been funding it for now 4 years. And the goal is to create collaboratives among women to teach them that if they pool their donkeys together, they are able, A, to provide rest to their donkeys, so their donkeys don't have to work 7 days a week. But in addition to that, when they pull them together, the work can be distributed. And as I always say, Dr. Jones, and you can correct me, women are extremely smart everywhere, but in the developing world, they're shockingly smart in my mind. They figured out that when they band together, there's actually opportunity to rent out their donkeys or to provide additional services, and they bring money home. When they bring money home, there's additional funds for their homes. There's also opportunities to put that money in bank accounts. If something happens to their donkey, if they need veterinary care or if they need to replace that donkey, there's money available. What's been most interesting to me is that we had to teach them credit and banking and savings. So that's out of our scope, but it became part of what we do. So again, I think it's those programs that bring women and people and animals together.
Yeah.
Dr. Jones, I wanted to just say something. When I was in India, one of the things that shocked me the most, and it goes back to what we don't understand in the US, is that the state of living of animals and people are equal.
Sure.
So it's not a matter of them not caring. It really is a matter of, I have photos where you can see the gentleman and he looks as starved as his animals do. It's very difficult. And I think it's such a huge challenge to be able to teach them that if they take care of their donkey, it will improve them as well. But there is no nastiness in it. It's just the way that their lives have been created. And always remember that we're the lucky ones and it's only the luck of the draw. We could be them.
Yeah. I think Melissa had a question. I saw one pop up.
You did. And if we know what our brick and mortar projects, any that are coming down the pipeline, or has that all changed due to COVID-19?
So we actually work on a rolling year system. So right now we are trying to complete projects in 2019. In 2020. I am so sorry. Projects in 2020, and we still need to raise money for our water troughs that are being built in Ethiopia. And there's so much more than water troughs. Dr. Jones, you always explain that it's not only the water trough, it's all the piping that goes into it from far regions. So that's our biggest program this year. We have not been able to completely, I believe it has to do with COVID-19. Our donations are down. So as soon as we complete that one, hopefully we will be looking at something else. To be honest with you, Melissa, water troughs is a mandate all over Africa. The other thing that we're raising money for, which is also brick and mortar, is the vehicles that are needed in Kenya. And Amanda, I always pass this on to you because you are now the resident mechanic.
That's
So,
it's a low bar. That's not a great. We are raising money. As we've mentioned, in Kenya, there is the donkey hide crisis, and it is putting a lot of pressure on our team there in. So what they have right now is essentially, well, it's not essentially, it is what we in the US call a Nissan Murano, which, if you are familiar with it, is a small SUV, not made for heavy terrain, not made for long distances. As our team in Kenya continues to have to run out to handle an issue with the donkey hide crisis, a family has just lost their donkey, or there's been some kind of a problem with the shelters or anything like that. They only have the one working vehicle. So they will sometimes have to rent a vehicle, which is extraordinarily cost prohibitive, or they can only send a couple people out at a time. So if someone's already booked that truck so that they can go to one of their new expansion sites, some of which are hundreds of miles away, then they can't. So they're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. They've identified a 4x4 vehicle that's great with off-roading and has an extra diesel tank. And they have presented that as their best option. And so we are working on closing that up, and we are still
raising.
that would put them at 2 vehicles. Well, that would put them at 1 off-road vehicle and 1 city vehicle, which would be great for them. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we're 5 minutes over right now. So I do want to quickly run through this, how you can help. Emily, do you want to do it? Would you like me to?
You can do it. No,
Great.
no problem.
So we have, certainly, as we've said, we have a number of projects that we're working on closing, and COVID-19 is coming to hit hard. So one of our first and easiest ways to donate, to help, is to donate at brookeusa.org. You can do monthly, you can do a one-time. If you'd like to support us, we hope that you will. And hopefully our website makes it very easy for you. We also are launching Paint America Orange, which I've talked with some of you about, because I know in Northern California, this is one place we'd love to do it. When we are not all quarantining at home, this often looks like holding a fundraiser at your barn, or it might look like holding a bake sale or a small party. That's less likely to happen now, but we certainly have a lot of ways you can help us with virtual fundraisers if that's something that you would like to do. And then a third and easy way is just to help us spread the word. If you know people who would like what Brooke USA does and would like to learn more about us and would like to hang out with us virtually, you can send this recording on. I will be sending this recording out probably tomorrow morning. You can certainly forward this. We also are having 2 more, which I will be sending invitations to. One a week from today with Ingrid Hoffman, who is a celebrity chef and one of our ambassadors. And then 2 weeks from today, on June 30th, it will be
Amanda, July.
Oh my God, July. You said 2019 and I said June. July 2020, July 23rd and July 30th. And that'll be Casey Perry Glass, who's an Olympian dressage rider, and also one of our ambassadors, and has been to Guatemala to see our work in person. So she'll have a very interesting perspective. So we hope you'll join us for that. And if you can't, share the invitation with someone who you think would. And it will be July, not June. It is in a week or 2 weeks, not in 11 months. So that's a great way to end this.
If there's any questions at the last minute, we can take them right now. I don't know if anybody wants to stay on a meeting. Maybe they can just ask them now.
I think we've lost most of our, because we're 8 minutes over, so we should wrap it up. But thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you enjoyed yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. We love
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Big thank you to you.
Yep. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.